Okay, it looks like it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we start, I want to preface this talk by saying that it's listed in the session agenda as an introductory or beginner session. So this is definitely introductory and beginner information. If you've been working with JavaScript or web development for a while, we're not going to be offended if you want to go find a more advanced session or a session with content that might be better suited for your level. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. The slides that we're going to present, the tiny URL is up there. It links you to a GitHub repository that has the slides and a few demos that we're going to show in this session. My name is Kelly Hutchins. I'm a product engineer on the JavaScript team. I mostly work with ArcGIS Online building or creating configurable apps. And I'm presenting with my colleague, Heather Gonzago. She's a product engineer on the JavaScript team as well. So quick overview, we're going to talk about some developer setup. So some things that we use in our development environment that make our lives easier. I kind of think of most of this session as these are things that I wish I'd known on my first day of working with JavaScript. Tips that help me write less buggy code, find errors, fix errors, just little tools that make my life easier. We'll talk about a few debugging tricks in the browser. And finally, we'll go over a few of the common ArcGIS API for JavaScript questions that people ask us. So this is a developer setup section. One of the common questions that we often get asked is, I'm in an environment where I can't install IIS on my machine. Is there a quick and easy way that I can run and test my apps? Sometimes people will try and just like copy the sample locally, put it into an index.html file, double click that and run it in the browser. And then it's running over the file protocol. Some things will work, a lot of stuff won't work. Really, you should be running on a web server. So if you get IIS or Apache set up, that's one approach. Another approach, if either you can't install it because of admin permissions or you really just want a simple, quick and dirty way to get up and running, is to use one of these lightweight HTTP servers. There are lots of them available. There are Node versions available. I'm going to show you a quick example of what that looks like. And many IDEs have extensions that you can add to your development environment to quickly and easily open up a file. So let me show one of the demos we have. This one uses Express. It's Node-based. There's this little file. So I had to npm install this Express.js file and then write a little bit of code. And this is documented well on their website. So I had to write a little bit of code. And then in my package.json file, I wrote this little script that I can run that just starts that node server.js. So let's run it. And it's going to do some stuff down here in the terminal. And it tells me that now I have this web server running on localhost, and I can command click to follow. And now I have my app running. It's not on the file protocol. It's actually running on this little HTTP server, so things work. I'm up and running. I didn't need to be an admin and install IIS. I also mentioned, so that's one way, and that's installing this thing. In this example, it was Express.js. But many development environments have extensions, including Visual Studio Code. I installed one called Live Server. It adds this little button here at the bottom of my development environment. I don't know if you can see it, but it says Go Live. All I have to do is click that. It's going to look for an index.html file in my project, and it's going to spin it up. So that's also a really nice way to get up and running. And that Express.js demo is in the GitHub repository that we linked you to on the first page. Code assist is another question we get asked commonly. People want to know, especially if you're coming from an environment that had it, they want to know how to get code assist, so how to see what they're typing when working with JavaScript. There are sort of two ways that you can get it. One is if you're working with TypeScript, you get code assist. If you don't want to use TypeScript, you can get it in JavaScript if you work with Babel. How many people here are, number one, using TypeScript? A couple, okay. How about Babel? Okay, so I have lots of detailed instructions. So let me just show that sample really quickly. This sample is also in that repository. It's called Code Assist. There is a README file that has step-by-step instructions for how you can get this set up. So another nice thing about working with Babel is besides getting Code Assist, this IntelliSense, you can also use ES6 features that are then compiled back into ES5 JavaScript, which means you can run it in browsers like Internet Explorer. So there are other nice features, but Code Assist is also a useful one. So now if I look at my main.js file, it's right here. I can type view, type it in the right place, type view dot, and I see that I get Code Assist, so I'll use go to, and then I can get the input parameters. So. And again, we don't have time to go through all the steps for getting that set up in this session, but those are all available step by step in this GitHub repository. This is just something that I find helpful that I use. Emmet comes as part of Visual Studio Code. It's also available in other development environments. I think Sublime has support for it, and I'm sure you can add it as an extension in other ones. So what this does, let me see if this GIF shows up. It's probably kind of small. I'll just show you in Visual Studio Code. So it's just a way of typing less. And I find that anytime you type less, you make fewer mistakes, right? If you can stub out that code and you don't have to type it, you're less at risk for making typos. So what this lets me do is it has a ton of commands. So if I type exclamation point, it shows me here that this is an Emmet abbreviation for an HTML template. So I can just hit tab, and I've got that HTML template that's stubbed out for me. If I want to add a link to a CSS file, I can just type link:CSS, stub it out, and it has these, the little bold blue part. That's parts I can just tab to and change. So I could just do main or CSS, main.css. So it just saves typing. There are a ton more things. You can do CSS with it. You could make a list. So I think you can type UL, greater than sign LI times 5, and then hit tab, and it'll create an unordered list with 5 empty list items in it. So there's a lot of really quick productivity tips. I really like Emmet. There's this plugin page. The link to it is in, again, the slides. But you can come here and see all the places that, all the environments or options where you can work with it in. I think it's pretty widely covered. Snippets are also another thing I use. I write a lot of the same code over and over again. I add links to the JavaScript API to my files all the time. I create a map. I use the require statements to import modules. I don't always like remembering the exact syntax that I need to use. So I use snippets. So I'll show you what a snippet looks like, and then I'll show you how to easily create them. So here's an example of a snippet. So I come here in my head and I type JSAPI, and that's a name I gave to the snippet. And I can look here and see that it's going to add a bunch of stuff to this file for me. So I just go tab, and I can see it added the links to the JSAPI, the CSS, and also the JavaScript. And it also set up this Dojo config, which we'll talk about a tiny bit in a little while. I also have them set up for my JavaScript file. So in a JavaScript file, I can type REQ, stub it out, and I get that require statement that I need to load the modules. And then I can come here and type map, stub it out, and I get my map code. So I use this a lot for boilerplate code that I just don't want to write over and over and over again. There's this really nice handy tool called the snippet generator, where you could just take code that you're interested in turning into a snippet, paste it in here, give it a description, and the tab trigger is the word that you'll type in the file in order to have that snippet appear. And then you can just copy it. It creates the snippet for VS Code, Sublime Text, or Atom. So you can create that snippet, and then there's a preferences snippets file where you can paste that, and then it's available to you when you're working with Visual Studio. I have the ones I use a lot. I haven't updated them recently, but the general way they work. In my GitHub repository, I have this code snippets JSAPI repo, and it just has the snippets I use for TypeScript, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. There's nothing super fancy there. It's mostly just some basic boilerplate stuff that I can use to get up and running quickly. JSAPI resources. This is another GitHub repository I wanted to point you to. It's got some useful pieces of information. Let's go there really quickly. So it's Esri/JSAPI-resources. This Esri GitHub repository is one where you'll find a lot of useful code samples too. So we open source a lot of the configurable apps. There are some widgets that people have created and put them out there. So if you ever want to write an app or write some custom code, this is a good place to come and kind of search around and see if you can find something that gets you partway where you need to go. But if we look in this JSHint file, there's this JSHint RC. This just helps you write better JavaScript by enforcing some rules. So you might be working with multiple developers in your organization and you want your code to look the same and follow the same rules. Are we all using single quotes instead of double quotes for strings? Tabs versus spaces? How are we formatting our curly brackets on where they appear on each line? So if you want to see the rules that we use, you can come copy and paste these rules into a .jshint RC file in your web server root directory, and those rules will work with JSHint. There's a bunch of other things there as well. The TypeScript definition files are there if you want to take a look at those. And there's some information on build tools like Bower that you can also find. This one, we're just going to go over it really briefly. If you look at all the samples in the SDK, they're all in one file, an index.html file. And we use the style tags to add the CSS, and we use script tags to add the JavaScript. So a question we sometimes get at conferences is, I'm new to JavaScript. I see all the samples are in one file. I really know that I need to start breaking my app out into multiple files. How do I do that? So we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I just wanted to show you a simple app that has that done and what the key pieces are. So here I have this test application. And if I look at it, I can see that this is my index.html file. And I don't have the CSS loaded in here anymore with the style, which is how you look at it in the samples. Instead, I have a link, and that link is to a style sheet, and it's looking in the CSS folder for a file called main.css. And that's the file where I'm going to store my CSS. And this is how I load it into that index.html. So instead of including an inline here, I include it in a separate file and link to it here. So that's the easy one. The JavaScript one is slightly trickier. We use dojo.config. This lets us configure the AMD loader to know where to find our separate JavaScript module. So this gobbledygook, you can just copy and paste. It's basically saying in your app's root directory, look for a folder called app, and that's where we would put our JavaScript files. And then down here in the body, we can have one script tag that just does a require. It says, hey, look in that app for this file called main. So if I look here, I can see I have a folder called app and a file called main.js. And again, this demo's out there. If you want, you can make snippets from all that, and then you don't have to remember it. You just put that in there, copy paste it, and you're good to go. Some additional resources that I think are helpful is Renee, he works here at Esri. You guys probably have seen him. He gives great presentations. He also has a blog with a lot of really useful information. He often posts little videos and blog articles. So I would definitely check out his blog and also follow him on Twitter. He's got some more advanced tips and tricks. Sorry, I have to fix my microphone really quickly. Okay, so that's Renee's blog. How many people working with 3D, building 3D apps? A couple of you? Raluca, who's one of the product engineers on the JavaScript team. Did I open that up? Created this cheat sheet for some common 3D code snippets that she finds useful. So if you want to do something like rotate the globe or interact with the camera, create a 3D tour of a set of points, and then a few more 3D snippets. So if you're working with 3D, there's some useful stuff here. This is actually one of my favorites. It's getting information about the camera. So if you're working with 3D, sometimes you want your application to start with a particular location with tilt and camera. It's kind of hard to figure that out, or I find it tricky to figure it out just by guessing at numbers. So you can go to one of the samples, get the globe where you want it and say that's exactly how I want it to look, and then spit out this information, and then you can copy that and put it back into your code. So I would definitely check this out. It also shows how to print out the extent, which you can then copy and paste into your code. So that's another helpful tip. So check out Raluca's snippets. And then this arcade expressions repo. So arcade expressions can be used in the labels, rendering, and pop-ups. You can do some extra interesting things with them. If you haven't heard of them, it's worth checking out the doc for arcade and also this repo, because there are some expressions that people on the team have created, and also people in the user community have submitted pull requests to add new expressions to this repo. So if we look at the pop-up one, there's things that you can do, like it's got an example of how you could create a top 5 list in your pop-up using arcade. He's got a good workflow about what is going on. And then down here, you can actually look at a web map that's using that arcade expression. And basically, it's creating a pop-up content that looks like this. Now we're going to talk a little bit about browser dev tools. First, we'll get started with extensions. There are a lot of extensions that we use on a regular basis that we find helpful. One that I like is called What Font. I think I have it installed here. I can just click on What Font, and then I can come here and hold my mouse over some font that I'm interested in looking at. Let's use it on a page where we actually have stuff. And I can see what font is being used. I find this useful when I'm debugging, or sometimes if I'm on a web page and I'm like, oh, I like that font, I wonder what it is. I can just inspect it and see what it is. Another one that I use all the time is JSON View. That will let me go to ArcGIS.com really quickly. I remember to turn my phone off, but I forget to turn my watch off, and someone decides to call. So with JSON View, what I can do is if I'm in the Network tab, let's say I want to look at one of these requests, and this request returns JSON, I can look at it in here. It's not formatted very nicely, and it's also kind of small. So often I'll open it in a new tab so I can look at it in a bigger window. And I don't know if you saw really quickly when it first displays, it displays all as one big block, and that JSON formatter basically just spits it out so I can look at it in a much nicer manner. So I think that one's super useful. I also use some accessibility extensions, but we'll talk about those later. Heather, do you have?
I like the code beautifier. I have the code, the JavaScript and CSS code beautifier on mine, and these 3. So yeah, so if a lot of times I'll just want to go and do the quick, command Shift-U or whatever the keystrokes are and go ahead and open up the source behind my code. And if I have a JavaScript file like this, again, it looks like a bunch of gobbledygook, especially if you have a lot. This goes in and actually just makes it look a little bit prettier and breaks it out for you, just a little bit more pleasing on the eyes. All right. Any others? Did you want to talk about? You good?
It's all you now.
Cool. All right. So, any of you guys here, you work in the developer tools within your browser? Show of hands. Familiar? Cool. Good. If you are not, probably the first thing you need to get familiarized with. It doesn't matter what browser you work with, whether it's Chrome or Internet Explorer, Edge, Firefox, Safari, they all have an associated, they have developer tools that you can open up and play around in. So for the sake of our demos, we're going to show everything in Chrome. That's the one that I'm the most familiar with, but again, you know, whatever browser you are working with, they should have something comparable. So the first thing I'd like to show is we're going to talk a little bit about the console messages. This is probably for, especially if you're just beginning, console, like console log statements, probably going to be the first line of defense when trying to figure out exactly maybe where some of your problems might be coming up within your code. So you can get a lot of really good information that gets logged out into your console. And us, as the JavaScript API team as well, we also write into our source a lot of good messaging, and we're trying to get better as well as versions go along. We're writing more messages into the source so that if you do get errors, hopefully they will be more descriptive. So let's take a quick look at one. All right, so I have a very simple application here. It's just showing a feature layer, and I have some attachments and a little bit of text. And I know what it's supposed to look like, but it's not showing me what I would expect. I'm actually supposed to have a name, title, show up here as well, and I'm not getting that. So the first thing that I would take a look at is if you go into the developer tools, and on my Mac it's just Option Command I, but it'd be something very similar. You just go into your tools and developer tools. So if we take a look here, hopefully what we would see is maybe we'll get some console errors. And in this particular case, I did. I actually have, if we took a look at the code, well, it's telling me that I have an invalid field name. So if we take a look at the actual code, and I'm going to open it up here. It just makes it a little bit easier to see. Maybe not that big. All right. So it's telling me this NAM field is not defined. Well, if I take a look, and my code's not that big, if I take a look at it here, I can see easily, all right, I've got this NAM field. What is this? Where is this coming from? So let's go in, and if we actually look at the URL for this service, so basically what we're doing is we're creating, we're showing the title based upon field information. So I passed in this name field, misspelled it, of course, but if I wouldn't know that, or maybe it's a casing issue, maybe underscores or whatever you may have in there, it can throw it throws me off a lot. So if we take a look within the actual the layer, and we look at the fields, we can see here it should just be coming over as name. So I'm going to fix that. And we're going to go back in, close that down, refresh it. All right, and let's go ahead and click on one of these guys, and now we actually have something telling me, hey, okay, this is, I'm seeing the title, the appropriate title in this case. So you can also do things, for example, what I like to do is if we have, you can actually go ahead and do console, you can write out console log statements. So if you want to find, for example, I've showed this before in our intro session, a lot of times, let's say, for example, you want to get an extent of your view, and you're not quite sure exactly what maybe the latitude and longitude, the center latitude and longitude is. You can create a global variable within your code and then access that with, you can go in, mess around, zoom in and zoom out, and mess around with that within your application and console log out the appropriate coordinates. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you that very quickly. Might make it easier to see. All right, let me open up. If I get in the right. Okay, getting started. All right. All right. Okay, so what we have here, it's a really basic app, but what you'll notice here at the very top is I have this view global variable set. What I'm going to do now is you'll notice here I have these coordinates and a zoom level set to, I think it's just the United States. So if we took a look at the actual code, all right, so let's say now, though, that I want to go in and say, I want to zoom to Florida. I want my extent, my new application, I want this extent to be in Florida. I don't know the exact coordinate location, but it's just a little bit easier if I can just go in here and not have to play around with it too much. Just open up my, my dev tools. Oh, don't mind that. I didn't update the CSS file I was showing in my last demo. I was showing what happens if you don't have a CSS file, and we'll get to that here at the end too. So, all right. So if we take a look at the view, you'll see here it just gives us a big old huge object with a bunch of properties associated with it. But I want to get the view, center, latitude, there. So now I know what the latitude is. My new latitude of this zoomed in location. And the new longitude of the zoomed in location. I can go in here, get the zoom level, 5. So if I went in, and let's just copy and paste that. Okay, 5, save that out, and let's go in and what I did here, this might be very common basic for some of you guys, but I know I never noticed this for probably longer than I'm a little embarrassed to say. If you just hold down the reset or the refresh, you'll get this empty cache and hard reload. Okay, so that's just an easy way of just going in and clearing everything out if you're making any changes, and it'll just bring everything on up. Hopefully, bring those changes up. All right, so now you see when I refreshed it, I didn't get the full United States. I'm now in Florida. All right, did I want to show anything else on that? Did you want to add anything else on that?
No, got it.
There's a lot. I'm just like, there's a lot of stuff that you can do within the console, but these are probably the basic ones. You can also throw in console log statements as well within your code. So if you're not sure if you're getting an actual value back on something, if an object or you're wanting to check a property, throw in a console log, run your code, and then from there, you should be able to see everything within that console window. So next, we also have debugging. So just pausing your code as you're running it, stepping through your code and actually seeing, making sure that it is, the application is running in the steps that you would expect it to run in. So there's a couple ways of doing this. You can set breakpoints directly in the developer tools, or you can actually add just a debugger line, a statement, just a one-word statement within the code itself. So go back to this attachments. And what I'd like to do here, can we see that okay? Alrighty, cool. So let's take a look now, and what we should see is I have updated, yeah, I did. I updated the name, so everything should be good. But if I just wanted to make sure, in this case, the code is working okay. But what you can do is we can just go in, set some breakpoints directly. Am I in the right thing? Should be. You know what? I had this problem before. I've noticed this, so I don't know if it's something with the developer tools, and if someone later can show me if they've had this before as well. I've noticed, does anybody here ever work with the file system, like use workspaces in the developer tools? Anybody? No? I do it for minor updates on things. So this is something, I wasn't going to go into too much detail on it, but just something that in case you guys are interested in, it's kind of cool. You can go and click on, so by default, when you open up your developer tools, it's just going to show you the source, your page that you're currently on. That's HTTP. It's hosted up through HTTP. You can access the file system, your workspace that you're actually working on, your developer workspace. So in my case, I've got some repositories set up here for some of my samples. I can go in here, and if we took a look, I actually added a folder to this workspace. So in this case, I'm going to open up a different one. I'm going to show you something different here, a better sample. So this is a sample that we have on our in our SDK in our sample code, and basically what it's supposed to do is when you click on a location, it's supposed to show you a pop-up with a DOM node in it. Basically that DOM node is just showing you the map view. So we're in a scene view here, and it's supposed to show you the map view. When I click, nothing is happening. So I remember working on this before in the past, and just going in, I didn't want to have to open up Visual Studio Code and messing around with things if I just knew maybe it was just a couple lines that needed to be updated. So I added this folder to my workspace, and basically what happens, and I'll show you really quickly, just in case you guys are interested, you can go in and just do there. You can click a folder, tell it this is my workspace, and you need to give it permissions to access it. Once you give it those permissions, it'll show up then within the left-hand side. I'm going to deny it for now because we're not going down that. We're not going to work in that particular workspace. But so basically, what I could do though for this code is I could set some breakpoints in here and basically step through it. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not gonna bore you all with that. But I could set some breakpoints in here, and I'm not able to right now. And I think it's because I've been going back and forth between. I've had this before in the past, and I need to take a look and see what might be causing some of the issues. But you can go if you have the file system set up. Sometimes it doesn't clear them out properly. But if you go in, you can add a breakpoint, and then if you run your code, it should stop on that breakpoint, and then you can go in and step through it. If you hover over, now in this case, I know my pop-up view is not defined yet, mainly because I'm right in the beginning of it. I haven't gone in and instantiated it. But if I could step through everything, and in this case, it's actually going to drill down into the source. So we're not going to worry about all of that. We're just going to step over all of it. And what I could do is if I added more breakpoints in there, I could just go in and just continuously play to the next, just jump over and play to the next breakpoint. So let me go in here and get out of this. And I know just because I was messing around with this before, but I know what the problem is. And it is because I have a typo here. This should be a capital M, not a lowercase m. And I'm saving this. And what you guys should notice is I'm actually saving this in my workspace. So hopefully, if I go in here, oh, forgot to turn that off. Turn that off, nope. Do this again. It should work. There you go. All right, but that's just one of the things. There's, again, you could spend a lot of time messing around and kind of really getting familiarized. There's a lot of really good tutorials, YouTube videos out there, just kind of getting familiarized, even in just in the Chrome Dev Tools, but I'm sure they've got it in all the others as well. Did you want to add anything on that, Cal?
No, you're good.
All right. So next we have debugging network requests. So a lot of times, hold on here, we don't want to leave that yet. Sorry, I want to close some tabs down. I don't want to get too confused here. So sometimes what can happen, you may not be getting back the results that you expect. So what I like to do, what you just saw Kelly do earlier when she opened up ArcGIS Online and opened up her developer tools and took a look at the JSON, you can go in and inspect the network traffic that goes through. So all of those requests that are being made. So I'd like to show a sample. And this is just a sample that we have. It's a viewshed sample. And for the sake of time, because sometimes, depending on our network, it could take a little bit. I already ran it beforehand. Basically what it does is if you click on a point, a location on the, within the view, it creates a viewshed based upon the parameters that are specified within this viewshed, this geoprocessing task. So if we take a quick look at the developer tools, you can see here, under the network tab, I'm going to go in and I'm going to refresh this so we can actually see. Close that out. All right. So you can see here all of these requests that are being made. My image server requests, map server service requests. And if I wanted to, I can actually, I'm going to go back here and actually do the execute, the viewshed analysis. What we should see here is we have, I don't know if you guys can see this at the very bottom, we have an execute, where did it go? We have an execute operation that is being fired. So I can go in here, I can open that up in a new tab. I have an extension installed on my browser to make it look a little bit, nicer. And you can see here I'm getting an error, so I probably did something incorrectly or maybe didn't wait around long enough. Before when I did it, this is what I got back. So I have the results that were, that came back from this viewshed analysis. But what I'd really like to take note of is when you run this, let's try this one more time with our fingers crossed. Come on. A lot of people might be trying to, there we go. Okay, so it did do something. Awesome. So we have that, that viewshed analysis that was run. What I like to do is take a look, so this was the bad one. We aren't gonna worry about that. Take a look at this one. Let's take a look at the header information that goes through. So a lot of times when, if we get a bug or questions that come through, one of the first things that I like to double check is to make sure that the problem may not necessarily be within the API. Let's make sure the problem isn't directly with how the service is being handled, or maybe you're not passing the proper parameters incorrectly. This is where you can go in and inspect the network traffic and take a look at, so in this particular case, we have our query strings. So it's already set up. Take a look at the code behind this, but I believe the service may already have some of this stuff set up as well. If we take a look though, normally what I'd like to do is I like to open it up in the services directory and then take those same parameters, those same query parameters, and put them into the services directory and execute it from here to see if you get the same results, if you get errors or if it actually works. So this is just one particular case, but it can be done with any request, any of the query requests that you have. It's a really useful, it's a good tool to get comfortable with, just going through and inspecting that network traffic. All right. Okay, and Kelly is gonna dazzle you with some CSS.
I don't know about dazzle, but let's really quickly look at some of the things that I do on a regular basis when I'm trying to modify the CSS in an application. There's a bunch of information you can find out in the browser developer tools. I'm using Chrome in this example, but I could do the same things with Firefox. So here I have one of the samples. I've opened the developer tools. If I click on one of these elements, I can either select it on the page or click it here in the elements section. I can see all the styles that are associated with that. You can see which styles are overwritten because they have a line through them. So something else, in this case, we had word break that was set to break word, but it was overwritten by this normal word break in another rule. I can see where that rule is from. I can hover over it and see which CSS file has the rule in it that's overriding the one that I was perhaps expecting. You can access the pseudo classes like hover. So if I want to see what happens when I focus this element, I can click on that and see the rules associated with it. I can also see the classes associated with that element. If I want to see if one of these classes is causing a problem, I can turn it off and see what changes that makes just by turning off those classes, clicking them here. The nice thing about this is all temporary, nothing permanent. I'm not affecting what's going on in my underlying code. I can just play around in here. Another tool I like is, let's say we want to change the color to orange. I can do that here, test it out, see how it looks. You can also click on the color and use this color picker to pull a color from somewhere else in your app, and that you can apply that. The nice feature of this color picker is that if you work in an environment where you have to build apps that are accessible, so 508 or WCAG requirements, the color picker will actually tell you if the color you picked meets the requirements. So here, we know the contrast ratio of 5.88 has one check mark next to it, so it meets the color contrast requirements at the A level. 2 check marks means double A. If we don't meet the color contrast, so let me pick, let's see if we can get a bad color. So there I picked this red color, and you see you get the little no icon. That means you don't meet the color contrast requirements. So this is a nice tool just to check out color contrast in your site. Some other stuff that I find useful in the browsers is mobile emulation. This is not perfect, but for quick and dirty testing, just to see if your breakpoints are set up correctly and your site looks as you'd expect, you can come into the dev tools. Here in Chrome, I just toggle this device toolbar, and I can either choose responsive mode, where I can drag it around and check various breakpoints, or I can choose from a set of devices, and I can see how things look. So again, this is great. I use it all the time for breakpoint debugging to see, if I want to collapse something at certain screen sizes, I can test it out quickly here. I just want to reiterate again that it's not a permanent substitute for testing on a device. You should actually test on a device before you release to production. Throttling, so you can test slow networks. In the developer tools, you can click on throttling to throttle it. And geolocation, I actually use this occasionally. So here I have a locate sample from the help. We have this locate button that uses the HTML5 geolocation API underneath to find your current location in the world. So that's great if you're building an app where you actually physically are, because if I click this button, it's going to find my location here in Palm Springs in the convention center. But what if I'm developing an app for a customer who is someplace else in the world, and I want to test, it uses your location to find things around you. So I want my location to be that other place in the world. You can sort of spoof that location. If you come to more tools, sensors, and then it has this geolocation. You can specify a custom location so you can enter the lat long, but I'll just show you with some presets. So let's say I want that location to be Moscow. Now if I click the location, it's going to take me in Moscow so I can test out my app in the appropriate location. Accessibility, so again, if you're building a site and you need to conform to 508 or WCAG requirements, there are a lot of tools available to you in the browser to do this. How many of you guys have to meet these requirements? Okay, a couple of you. For the ones who aren't, it's a good thing to do. You should check out the requirements. Making your site accessible makes it better for everybody to use. It makes your website more usable. But there are a lot of tools available in the browser. I showed you the color contrast one, so you can check your color contrast. And I'll show you really quickly an audit that's available in Chrome DevTools. So if I come here, there's an audit section. There's actually some useful audits that you can build. You can audit your website for performance, and it will give you some tips on how to improve the performance of your website. You can see if it's a PWA, if it meets the requirements, get some tips to turn it into one, best practices, accessibility, etc. So I can just choose accessibility, run the audit. It's going to go through and do its thing. We may not wait for it to finish. It'll run through, it'll finish, and it'll return a list of accessibility problems in my app. Like it says here that the HTML element doesn't have a lang attribute. I can find out more information about it and actually hover over and find out exactly which element is causing the problem. So this is a good site to check out. Now we're going to go into like some of the FAQs we get. These are questions that we get asked at the showcase or on GeoNet, things that come up all the time, common problems that people run into. Let's see how we're doing on time. I'm going to turn it back to Heather.
Okay, so first things first, every time we release every 3 months. So first, when you want to go in and check things out, the very, very first place you should be looking at is our release notes. So if you go to the developer site, so it's just developers, ArcGIS.com, JavaScript, it'll be directly under the guide topic and then release notes. This is where you're going to see everything new that was added. In addition, you're going to see all of the bugs. So if this was a logged bug, you went ahead and called support, and there was like a BUG or an ENH associated number with that, that will be added here. So you can go ahead and track that. In addition, if you have any GeoNet issues that may have been brought up, we'll go ahead and add those in there as well. So breaking changes, we try not to break things, but sometimes it's unavoidable. So if you're seeing something weird, you can't find something where it used to be, go in and check the release notes first, just to make sure that it hasn't been touched upon already. Okay, so this is more for like the very new people. When you are working with the SDK and the API reference, this is more of just to touch upon how to actually read the documentation for the actual class, the classes themselves. We have in each individual class, we're going to have require statements provided to you and a preferred argument that we suggest that you use. You don't have to use whatever we give here, like in this case, layer list. You can call it whatever you want, but you do need to make sure that when you have your require statements within your code, that it is exactly as we have it specified here. Okay, we tell you where your where these classes are inheriting from. We'll give you, in this particular case, it's a widget, so we have some of the source for the widget view, some of the SAS files. We will give you any of the samples, link to view models. So yeah, there's a lot of really good information in there as well. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely just go in and maybe just peruse it a bit to kind of familiarize yourself. This is a big one. We get this every single conference I work. There's still a lot of people in 3 wanting to move to 4. They are maybe needing a specific type of functionality. This is where you're going to want to go in and double check to see if it's there, if it's not there. Maybe we have the same functionality in 4, but maybe it's not called the same thing anymore. This is where you would go in and take a look. So, for example, one of my favorite class names back from the 3X days was ArcGIS Dynamic Map Service Layer. That was a mouthful. It's the same exact thing, we just renamed it to Map Image Layer. All right, so this is where you would go in and just basically take a look to see if it's there or if it's not. All right, I talked a little bit about making sure you have that require statement set specifically exactly as it is written within the API reference. Here we say module order matters. I'm not going to go, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I do want to touch upon, I had a few people just this week when I was helping out in the showcase, just going in and saying, I'm getting these weird errors, like can't find this one property off of this class. And I was like, all right, let's take a quick look. And we would go in and we saw that a lot of times, especially if you're messing around and you're working in code and you're copying and pasting and moving things around, you may have forgotten that this module order matters, which that basically means is that in this case, we have web map, a layer list, and a map view. You have to specify the arguments for those associated require statements. They need to be exactly as, they have to be in order. So if you go in and flip-flop map view with web map and you try to run it, you're going to get error messages because it's going to think that your map view is trying to get, you're calling map view and you're trying to get map view functionality off of the web map. Okay, so just make sure it's a quick and easy way to double check on things, but I always Kelly tells people too, if you want to be an MVP on the GeoNet, that's a good one to check on because you get that all the time. Mixed content, this you'll get sometimes when when you're working with HTTP to HTTPS. So maybe you'll open up some of your samples or you're accessing some of our services, some services that you have that are HTTP, but you're working in HTTPS. We will swivel and should take those services and move them to HTTPS, but sometimes it's not always going to be the case. Custom services and so forth. If you are on HTTP, that's also going to cause issues too. We usually tell people that it's best, if at all possible, to do your developing on HTTPS. We actually wrote this up in the 4.8 release notes. And you can get an archive of all the old release notes, but if you just scroll to the bottom, you'll see all of the previous releases. But we wrote about this a little bit in the 4.8 about how we automatically, we're promoting secured services now. So if you see that, just remember this, like, oh yeah, Heather mentioned something about this. Let me go ahead and read this. It's in there and you might be able to explain it a little bit better. So this can be an entire session on its own, so we're not going to go into major detail. There's cores and proxy pages. If you're working with secured services, if you may go in and be running samples and you open up you're not seeing maybe some of the layers that you expect to see, and you open up the dev tools and the console is telling you some weird error about you're not on a cores enabled server. Take a look at our cores guide. If you click on the guide topic underneath reference, cores, we basically go in here and we explain a bunch of this stuff to you. We've made it a lot easier. I wrote this topic a while back, and it used to be a lot more involved into it, and we've made things much, much simpler. There's actually another really good blog article that Julie wrote back when 4.9, and we have a link to that as well. So if anybody, if that is something you're interested in, just go ahead and take a look at that. And in addition, we also have a separate topic as well that talks about the proxy and how proxies work. Okay, Kel?
Really briefly, we're going to go over autocasting. We have a guide topic in the help that slide links to. You guys might be familiar with this code. It's basically creating a symbol, a renderer for a feature layer. So if you look at the top, we're loading a bunch of modules: simple line symbol, simple marker symbol, simple renderer. We're having to create new simple marker symbol, new color, new simple line symbol, new simple render. It's a lot of typing. With autocasting, instead, you can just do this. You notice that we have not imported those modules up here. We don't have to new everything. We're just creating a symbol, setting its type, setting the color to this RGB value or a hex value or a named color string, and then do the same thing with the outline. So it's a lot less typing, which I'm a huge fan of. The question that we often get is, how do you know if something can be autocasted? A quick way to check is to look in the API reference. So here's the API reference showing the color property. I can see that it says autocast next to it. If you see that autocast tag, then you know that you can do that. You don't have to import the module. You don't have to create a new color class. TypeScript is a little different. Autocasting generally only works in the constructor properties. If you're doing it outside of the constructor, you still need to import those modules. So that's if you're working with TypeScript. Another question we get with people who are working in 3x or even new to 4x, they want to do things like listen for when the extent changes, and they're like, where's the event? Where do I find an event to figure out when the extent changes? It's not how you do it anymore. You watch properties. So we have an example, the first bullet, you call this watch option, pass in the property you want to watch, and you get a callback function. It also works with nested properties, so you can do basemap.title and watch it. There's a sample here. Let's open it up. The sample's in the SDK. I like it because it has a lot of properties that it's watching, so you can see when these things fire, like when the extent changes, it will update the extent here. So you can come down and look at the code. Down here, you can see that we're watching for properties. It's using these watch utils, so you don't have to use watch utils. You could just do basemap.watch title. But the watch utils actually adds a lot of extra functionality. So there are cases when you'll want to use watch utils. So import that watch utils module. And you have access to all of these methods available on it. One that I use all the time is once. Sometimes you want to know when something happens just once, when the basemap title changes one time, like maybe when you initially load your app, or if someone just picks a layer or does something once, you can set that up. It's going to execute once. You can do whatever you need to do that one time and then never look at it again. You can also check when it's false once, when it's true once, when it's true, when it's false, a whole bunch of different options available here as well. Pausable, so if you want watch a property and not be watching it all the time, you might want to pause that. In some situations, you can use pausable. So I would encourage you to check out the documentation. There's also a guide topic on properties that you can look at if this is all new to you. We have 2 minutes. Let's see where we are on the slides really quickly. Geolocation, this is a really simple one. Our geolocation button on the map, and also the geolocation, use my location, that's available within the search API. Use HTML5 geolocation under the scenes, requires secure context. So if you ever have an app and it's not showing up and it's not working and you're running over HTTP, that's why it requires HTTPS. Localhost acts as HTTPS, so you can test locally. When you're debugging and testing locally, it would work. So that comes up sometimes. Well, it works locally on my machine when I run HTTP localhost, but it doesn't work when I deploy it to production under HTTP. It's because it requires HTTPS. Some troubleshooting tips, if you're posting a question on GeoNet or submitting it through support and you want to get your question answered, a good thing to do is to narrow the problem down first. Try and figure out if it's specific to your app. So if I have a problem in a big app, the first thing I'll do is go to the SDK samples and see if there's a sample that does something similar. Like if I'm having a problem with the base map gallery widget, I would go look at the base map gallery widget in the samples and see if I can break the sample to have the same faulty behavior that's in my app. And that helps when you're submitting a bug to support or through GeoNet and you have a question. You can say, well, it happens in my app with 5,000 lines of code, but I also reproduce it with your sample, right? So that's a great way to get, past all the introductory questions. Some of the other tips that Heather showed you about debugging network requests, all of that stuff helps as well. We won't talk about AGO Assistant. It's not super useful. I mean, it is useful, but it's not, we are out of time and it's not as useful as some of the other stuff. We have the survey up here. We'd really appreciate it if you guys fill it out. It'll help us do this session next year. This is always sort of a tough one to plan for. We don't always know what level of information is beginner information or, so if all of this was too easy or not what you expected or not what you were looking for, let us know. I'm going to call. Okay. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.
If you have any questions, you can come on up. We can take them up here.